Hi,
Okay.
I'm Mimi Swartz. I'd like to welcome you all to my session with Julia Sweig, who's written a spectacular biography of Lady Bird Johnson. And we're going to talk for a little while and then take some audience questions. So, Julia, welcome. And
Thank you, Mimi.
You're welcome. Let's just start with how you came to write this book.
Well, I worked for many years in foreign policy and Latin America and Cuba, and not at all in the field of American politics and history. But at a certain point, after doing that for quite a while in Washington, D.C. and New York, and being the only woman in the room often, I felt two things. One, I needed to teach myself something new. But second, I wanted to get my arms around the topic of women and power.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have a subject, Mimi. I didn't have a subject until a friend said, Lady Bird Johnson kept a diary the entire time she was in the White House. And of course, Lady Bird Johnson was married to the American president of the 20th century, most associated with the word power.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, maybe there's something there that I don't already know. Most certainly there might be. So I started reading her published diaries, which she published in 1970, and then went to the LBJ library and heard for the first time that incredible voice of hers narrating the assassination in Dallas. And that just drew me in entirely. That was the start.
And what was it? I had a question actually about that. What was it about her voice that made you think, oh, there's much more here?
Well, the fact that she had the drama and emotion that she could convey and the composure to give this kind of first draft narration of an incredible trauma, plus her East Texas lilt, the combination of it is what drew me in. And she did that first recording 8 days after the assassination. Yeah. And I learned subsequently that she had one of her little notebooks that she always kept with her on Air Force One on the way back from Dallas to Washington, and took notes in it. And so I was also drawn in by the idea that she could have that focus and presence of mind to convey so much in that incredibly traumatic moment she had just lived through.
Yeah. We were talking about how hard this book was for you. Can you talk a little bit about the difficulties of writing about Lady Bird?
Sure. Well, this is my first major biography as such, and as I said before, I've written other books that were just nowhere near as difficult, even those that were multi-archival and historical. But the Lady Bird story, she did leave an enormous amount of material. So one thing was just getting through the mountain of material, the 1,750,000 words of her diary transcript, the 123 hours of the audio that she first recorded it. I didn't listen to all 123 hours at first, but definitely over time. And I did read every word of it. Then there's all of the material itself, other than that, that's in the LBJ library, that's in other archives around the country. And there's LBJ's story as well. Yeah. So I had to teach myself the LBJ presidency and the context of the 1960s so that I could place her in the room where she always had been in any case.
I think, one of the things that interested me is that she was dismissed for so long. I mean, when you were talking about her East Texas lilt, when I was growing up, she was hammered for that. It was another way of dismissing her as, not just a silly woman, but as a hick. And so I wondered if, what you think of that, if you had to get past it, how you reacted to that. And why you think
I didn't have those biases. I mean, I was born, to put a date on it, in 1964. So the 60s were, I mean, my political awakening came a little bit later. And I look at her really, I think, with fresh eyes, not with the comparison to Jackie Kennedy, and maybe not even with that kind of North-South divide that was very prominent, you know, in the Eastern political elite versus corn-pone South and that kind of thing. I didn't have that at all. And plus, as soon as you get into her material, you see how smart she was, what a reader she was, how capable she was. So maybe I had more prejudice, if anything, against him than I did toward her.
Yeah. I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but the lens of a modern woman looking back at her, I think you would bring so much more, you know, generosity to her story. Does that?
That really resonates, Mimi, and thank you for that nice comment. You know, I was raising two teenagers 3 miles away from where she was raising two teenagers, and we were the same age, 50 to 55 years old, when I was writing the book and she was telling the story that I was trying to, you know, place into this book. And so I found her somehow relatable. I saw what she was doing as this kind of multitasking, incredibly difficult job of having a, you know, although, you know, at a much higher level, but as a professional, as a public figure, raising children, managing her very difficult husband, and doing it just a few miles away from here. I live right outside of Washington, D.C. The White House is 3 miles from here. Her house before that, you know, it's all just very kind of an intimate feeling of proximity. Plus, when she talks about the different neighborhoods in DC, and I know we'll get to that, where she was focusing, you know, that's my stomping ground too. So I found it all kind of accessible and surprising that somebody, I mean, I was born and raised in Chicago and grew up all over the country, but not in Texas. And yet I found her quite accessible.
I think one of the other things that struck me, I want to be sure that readers know about this quote. One of the things that struck me in your book was Christopher Lamenhaupt, who was an august book critic, described her as her diaries as a huge pile of motionless material. And that's so typical of a man of the time, I think.
Yes.
And I just, you know, it really has struck me. Well, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. When you talk about, one of the things I loved about the book was contrasting and also showing a much more nuanced relationship that she had with Jacqueline Kennedy. And one of the things that struck me is Lady Bird was a political wife almost by birth. She knew she was interested in politics. She went to those small towns in Texas. She cared. And Jackie was not that way. Can you talk about that a little? And then we'll talk more about their relationship.
Absolutely. The one thing I'll say about that Christopher Lamenhaupt review is that, you know, I can see why he would have focused on that, because there's a lot of material in the diaries that can be really hard to slog through. Let's just say, to be generous. But there's also an incredible amount of personal material where she talks about her own emotions and her own depression and the difficulty of seeing the backlash against her husband's White House policies, against her White House policies. So that focus of his is I think, a very gendered reaction. And thankfully, you see and did in the review that you wrote how much more there is that I was trying to draw out. The Jackie relationship, I didn't know that I was going to take on until I got into the material. But again, through the diaries and then through the correspondence between Jackie and Lady Bird and Lyndon during the vice presidency and leading up to the assassination and Jackie's exit from the White House, showed something that was just so complex and layered. And it had a an evolution to it. In the 1950s, the balance of power was that the Johnsons were on top and the Kennedys were underneath when LBJ was majority leader, and Jackie was new to the DC scene and not particularly interested in politics, as you say. Lady Bird had been on the rope line by then for decades. Lady Bird brings her into the Senate spouse world of kabuki intelligence gathering and intelligence spreading. And then when the Johnsons join the Kennedy ticket and they're now second fiddle, the power dynamics shift. But I think Lady Bird's very clever by then stepping in for Jackie during the 1960 campaign, making herself, as she did with Lyndon Johnson, totally indispensable, and just never saying no, saying yes to everything that Jackie didn't want to do, campaigning with her, with Rose Kennedy and with the sisters and sister-in-law all over the South and Texas, winning Texas for LBJ, for Kennedy, as Bobby Kennedy said. And I'll just say two more pieces about that relationship. The way the two orchestrated the transition of Jackie and the kids out of the White House and Lady Bird and her children and Lyndon into the White House is so tender and filled with grace. And those words can sound cliche, but I think they really did an exceptional job together. And again, when you hear Lady Bird's narration of it, it's tremendous. When Jackie leaves the White House and the dissonance sets in, and we hear Jackie in her interviews with Arthur Schlesinger Jr. really dissing Lady Bird and saying, what is she, a trained hunting dog? I never understood that relationship between the two of them. It gets pretty dark and tense. The bottom is that by the time Bobby Kennedy is assassinated, and the encounter they have at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York in 1968 is just incredibly painful. They reconstitute the relationship in both of their post-presidency, much later in the 1980s.
Yeah, I think it was, a much more nuanced relationship that had been discussed before your book. I think that's one of my favorite things about the book is just allowing these two women to be complex and to be themselves, and to see the arc of that.
Thank you. Yes, I tried.
Yeah, no, you did it. I'm trying to decide which direction I want to go here. Let's talk about, since we're on women, I talk about Lady Bird's relationship with her daughters, which I also thought you rendered really tenderly, but also in all its complexity. Can you tell the reader a little about Lady Bird's background, her childhood, and how it impacted sort of her daughters, especially when you talk about Lucy's wedding, I think?
Sure. Lady Bird was orphaned. I always say that she wasn't orphaned, but she lost her mother when she was 5 years old. Mm-hmm. And she was raised primarily by her father and by household staff, nannies who were descendants of enslaved people, by her aunt who came to live with them from Alabama. Her two older brothers were at boarding school, and she talks a lot. I speak about her in the present tense, but she spoke a lot about the experience of having access to nature as a form of solace, and also books as a form of solace. And I think that the loss of her mom and the independence that forced upon her, emotional independence, gave her kind of grit and resilience early on. I mean, that's a little bit of pop psychology that I don't love, but when she met LBJ and married him 6 weeks after meeting him, and married him, by the way, in San Antonio at St. Mark's Episcopal, she wore a lavender dress that she already had. They didn't have a ring. It was all very slapped together very quickly, nothing fancy about it. So when you ask about Lucy's wedding, well, that was the Time magazine called it a semi-royal event, a semi-monarchical event. There were 700 people there. It was over the top. I mean, I guess if I can say a kind of Texan scale, of wedding. But one of the things, and so I think maybe there was some making up for lost time and what she didn't have in that. But one of the things, and I did not interview the daughters for this book. I asked for interviews, but that didn't happen. But Lady Bird writes quite a bit about her access to her daughters that she gained, and this sounds kind of Obama, like Michelle Obama, like by virtue of having everybody under one roof. I mean, Linda was back and forth in and out of college in Texas, but you know that she finally had time to spend alone time with her daughters and to, you know, share confidences with them and have them do that with her. And then she watched them grow into young women, of course, and with their courtships and their engagements and their marriages. There was a second White House wedding. I don't know how they feel about it, but it seems to me that having spent so many years away, devoted to Lyndon's political operation in that, you know, cultural world of Washington, D.C., where a lot of politics happens over the dinner table, away from her kids, she found a way to make up a little bit for the lost time somewhat while they were in the White House.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, of course.
Yes. Can you remember your description of George Hamilton? Permatan.
No, could you remind me? Permatan. Right.
That was so strange to me, even growing up, that she would date sort of B-list Hollywood actor, I can't remember exactly. He called her a babe. Do you remember the line?
A babe with a brain or something. I don't know, but you know, I met her recently because we taped a show for CBS, and she talked on that show about George Hamilton and how, you know, she had always been somewhat jealous of her younger sister, so he made her feel pretty and, you know, helped in her becoming the woman she wanted to become, I guess. But it is sort of funny. I mean, most people don't know George Hamilton, but he did have a permatan.
It dates me again, but let's talk about her relationship with LBJ, which I thought the way you treated it was so interesting because, again, if you read Caro, there's a whole lot about the mistresses, and Lady Bird again gets, I mean, it's so interesting to me about Texas women in particular because they have so many social skills that allow them to be dismissed when they're actually tough as nails and can move forward regardless. I mean, I think her ability to deflect criticism and snobbishness in the service of what she wanted or what he wanted was so impressive. But here was a guy who had massive infidelities, could be very vulgar. So can you talk a little about how you treated those drawbacks?
I decided early on to take my cue from Lady Bird Johnson herself, who, when she was, she wrote to another author who was writing a biography of her when she was alive in 1995 or 6 or 7, that you can't try to understand Lyndon if you don't, or me, if you don't understand how totally intertwined our lives were. And so I took, you know, the focus in Caro and other journalistic accounts and sort of in the mythologies around the Johnsons on the vulgarities and the infidelities as the sum total of their relationship, to me deprives her of agency, and it paints her as a victim, and it keeps us from seeing her substance. So I don't want to dismiss or forgive the infidelities or vulgarities, but I want to just assume, and I did going in this, and the material bore it out, that there was a lot more there than that, and that the power she derived in the relationship, because of how much he relied upon her, not just for the emotional balance, but for the political strategist and the advisor that she was in shaping the presidency entirely, that must have more than compensated or at least contextualized that awful and I mean, perhaps quite poisonous component of their marriage. So that was my approach to it.
Well, she never really let it poison the marriage, I guess, right? I mean, I think.
Well, I mean, that's where it appears that she didn't, but I feel like the cliche that you can't judge a marriage from the outside really is more than a cliche. It's true. So maybe at some points it did, but it seems to have been compensated for in lots of different ways over the course of the years, because she was an ambitious woman who had vision for the country, and the opportunity in her marriage to LBJ to exercise that ambition and see part of that vision made manifest. So she stuck with him for good reason. I mean, I would say.
Well, I think the other thing that struck me about their relationship is that she had a sense of his mortality and frailty from the beginning.
Yeah.
A lot of it, a lot of her efforts were literally toward keeping him alive. Can you talk about that a little? I mean, it really started with the first election.
Well, it started with the first election when he was prone to kidney stones and had this big episode that wound up hospitalizing him. But I think where it's really profound is beginning with his massive heart attack in 1955, which does almost kill him. I didn't realize how close he was to death until I got into the material. And his father and uncle both died at the age of 60 from heart disease. LBJ was 56 when he gets into the White House. And so for both of them, the specter of disabling illness or death in the very near term was always present. And so she was trying, as you say in your review, trying to get him out of Washington alive from the very second they entered the White House.
Yeah, it was fascinating to me. I mean, I don't know what we think now. I'm thinking about Michelle Obama and how she could be in some ways more fully realized. I mean, it seems like if you're a first lady, you're always going to get hammered by somebody. But can you talk a little about the opportunities that a modern first lady has versus what somebody like Lady Bird had, 50 years ago? It's really...
Well, it's interesting, Mimi, because I see Lady Bird's occupation, that's the wrong word, her tenure in the White House, in the East Wing, I see it really as the bridge from Eleanor Roosevelt to Hillary Clinton. But when I think about, in the sense that she modernized the office of the First Lady, she put together a full-blown policy staff, especially for her work on the environment. She had a chief of staff. She had a press staff. She was, and this is really important and very similar to Hillary, part of the overall political operation of the White House, right? The East Wing wasn't there for just the China and the social events. It was there to advance the policy agenda of the LBJ presidency. And she did so, I mean, especially, well, in two ways, definitely on civil rights and Great Society and the environment on the upside, and on the downside, certainly on Vietnam. She clung to the merits of that war until the end of 1967, from what I can tell. But I'm not sure, and maybe it'll be different with Dr. Jill Biden. She's already keeping her job, for example. But Michelle Obama was enormously cautious. I mean, part of that was because of her race, right? She was appropriately aware of the institutions of white supremacy and the racial bias in this country being very easy to stoke and to bring to the surface. But I think Michelle Obama's tenure, I mean, I don't know what kind of documentation she's kept, so it's hard to totally evaluate it, but she was very, very careful. She chose obesity in children, and that seemed kind of benign, but underneath it, she was taking on the food industry. Lady Bird chooses beautification. It seems similarly benign, but underneath it, she's taking on the highway industry, the billboard industry, the chemical industry. She's got a much more radical environmental agenda, but both of them are curating their public image to manage, to purposely to deflect criticism and not draw negative attention.
I think that's such a fascinating way to put it. I mean, another way that I think Lady Bird was dismissed and is still remembered not so favorably is, oh, she's just the first lady who planted bluebonnets everywhere.
Right.
And
right.
Do you think it was the press at that time that didn't want to really, it just seems, why was it that way instead of what you're now describing?
Well, a few reasons. Number one, the press was focused on the LBJ presidency, and as Lady Bird herself said, she never forgave Lyndon's boys for making her describe her environmental agenda as beautification, which was a euphemism, like her own name in a way, but a euphemism for reasons that had to do with, at a time, 1962 is when Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring. Environmentalism is not a big national movement. It's not really part of the public consciousness. The period of Keep America Beautiful and of the idea of sort of growing the concept of kind of Teddy Roosevelt type national park conservation to a more a broader idea of democratic access to nature, especially in American cities, especially for communities of color, which was her focus. So the ornamental aspect of beautification is kind of a political Trojan horse. And over time, especially once the criticism starts, she becomes more and more comfortable focusing on the fundamental aspects that tie civil rights and social justice and environmentalism together. But it's missed because she also doesn't do a great job of articulating the connections and stating clearly what it is she's trying to do. She has a kind of big tent political coalition approach to it and really fascinating relationships with certain people in the landscape architecture movement, in DC politics, in radical aristocrats and their philanthropic dollars, but she doesn't call attention to what she's trying to do too explicitly. And I think that's also by design until the very end of her time in the White House.
Sort of by design, and again, because of her time, I think, I wonder what would have happened if she really tried to knock heads and demand, it would have collapsed, I would think.
Well, even when she, she's gotten some attention for her focus on the Highway Beautification Bill of 1965. That's kind of, other than the flowers and tulips and beautiful flowering bushes that are all over Washington, D.C. and in bloom right now, one part of her legacy, the wildflowers and bluebonnets in Texas, another. But when she tried to put her name and her political capital behind a bill that was supposed to regulate, in the 1950s, after the Interstate Highway Act was passed, the explosion of freeways around the country did a lot of damage, and it was done like in an unregulated way. And so we hear today, oh, you want billboards to be shorter and you want to plant flowers along highways. That sounds so benign, but in fact, it was challenging the automobile industry, and it was challenging the infrastructure impetus of big federal dollars and the businesses behind it. When she tried to do that, that's when the Republicans in the Congress went after her, and it was sort of something to giggle at now, but it was a woman in the White House putting her energy behind something, and she was attacked for it.
Yeah. It's I don't know. I've got a question from the audience before I ask my next question, but this is from Janet Miller.
Okay.
Besides her daughters, who were Lady Bird's closest support network and advisors who helped her in decision-making and activism? Who did she trust the most?
You know, she talked a lot about losing friends while she was in the White House over Vietnam. But the person that she trusted the absolute most was Liz Carpenter. Liz Carpenter was a Texan, of course, and a journalist by training, and she became her chief of staff and press secretary and kind of all-around advisor and aide in the White House. But she had been part of the Johnsons, Texas and Washington inner circle and worked as a reporter, even attending those teas that Eleanor Roosevelt had in the 1930s. So she had really been around the block. She knew how Washington worked. She had first went to work for Lyndon Johnson when he was vice president. And then when Lady Bird decided to campaign in the 1960 campaign, Liz starts to work for Lady Bird. And the two of them are just a force of nature. And she's the one who, other than Lady Bird, I would say in the entire White House operation, has the greatest ability to talk straight to LBJ.
Yeah, she was a force of nature.
I lost your audio for a minute. Yes.
Oh, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, it's just going in and out. We're fine.
When we were talking just a minute ago, we were talking about urban renewal and how much Lady Bird did, and I want to talk a little bit about what she tried to do in Washington. I mean, I was looking in the book at some of the drawings. I mean, if she'd been able to accomplish that kind of beautification / urban renewal, the city would have been transformed. But you also mentioned Hemisphere, which was a section that got cut. But I think since we're in San Antonio, at least virtually, can you talk a little bit about what you would have said, I guess, what was there that is on the cutting room floor?
Yes, of course. So in the 1940s and 50s, just to try to be really concise about this, there were urban renewal programs all around the country. And what that actually meant was the elimination of big parts of cities that were often inhabited by relatively poor communities of color all over the country, 300 cities around the United States, including in Washington, D.C. And part of her story in Washington is about trying to redress the downside of that by developing massive and desegregating massive park space in Washington along the Anacostia River. Okay. In San Antonio, skipping ahead, in 1968, the neighborhood of Germantown was eliminated in order to provide the land where Hemisphere was constructed. Mm-hmm. And it was a much smaller scale than what happened in most cities, but nevertheless, it was a neighborhood that was Mexican and German and Polish. There was a Jewish synagogue in the neighborhood, as I understand it. And Lady Bird was very invested. The Johnsons were very invested in Hemisphere because this was the opportunity to put Texas on the map as its cosmopolitan bridge between the Americas of the Southern Hemisphere and North America. And she went there to inaugurate it in the days immediately after Martin Luther King's assassination. Mm-hmm. So what was cut from the story was a lot more detail about Hemisphere itself, the controversy, and her, by the way, I didn't see any evidence of her awareness that the space where Hemisphere was built on this where people used to live. So that's just an irony of public life more than an irony. I mean, it's a big contradiction, but it's very common, right? Public figures are not clean purists. They don't stay within the lines ever. Things are messy. At Hemisphere, and this is the last thing I'll say, and goes beyond the urban renewal story, the United States Institute USIA, the United States Information Agency, paid for the U.S. At Hemisphere, and maybe some of you who are listening or tuning in today were there. Each country had its own pavilion, as with every World's Fair. And in the U.S. pavilion, there was a big screening area for a film. Yeah. Did you see the film? Do you remember seeing it?
I think I saw it like 4 or 5 times.
Well, it was very controversial because maybe you remember, and I'm forgetting the name, there were 2 Jewish refugees, I think from Vienna, who had made very successful films for the USIA in Montreal at the World's Fair before that. And they were contracted to do the film, and the film was this grainy black and white negative depiction of the American cities that had been where riots had been. And it was, its narration was very negative, and it was this total embarrassment to the White House. And Lady Bird had to sit through it and watch and then try to find something positive to say. But it was really that country of urban riots and protests, not the country that she was hoping to highlight 2 days after MLK was assassinated.
Oh my God. 'Cause I just remember a multimedia thing with, you're probably right. That would have been when a lot of us were just beginning to get politicized. So we probably all loved the film, but whoops.
Probably.
I'm trying to think what else. Oh, I would like to go back to the teas that Eleanor Roosevelt had, but that Lady Bird really institutionalized. And again, what struck me, I never thought of her as an early feminist, but in that group that if you can talk about the group that she formed, even the name was so ahead of its.
Yes, Lady Bird had a kind of curated feminism, and I can't credit myself for that phrase. My wonderful research assistant came up with it, in Isabel Dorval, and it's perfect because, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in August of 1963. The President Kennedy's White House Commission on the Status of Women was published right before he was assassinated. So when Lady Bird comes in, the women's movement is really starting to make itself felt. The National Organization of Women is formed a couple years later, but her feminism is about emphasizing women as professionals and about stressing 20 years before Helen Gurley Brown that you can have it all. She gave a speech in 1964 at Radcliffe in which she told the graduates, civic duty, political participation, profession, family, husband, do all of that. You should, and that's what's expected of you, right? I mean, we all know how exhausting that is, but that was her perspective.
Yeah.
What? Yeah. So at the White House, starting in 1964, she had these things called doers' luncheons. And you're right to connect it to Eleanor's teas. But the luncheons, she would have between 25 and 100 people come to these luncheons to listen to a talk by a women professionals. And one of the first people she had was the woman that went on to found the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, who gave a speech about the importance that women document their lives and keep records, right? So I'm thinking about her and her diary. The second person, if I have the order right, was Jane Jacobs, who was an ardent activist about the urban space and who had taken on Robert Moses in New York City around how to retain some sense of community while building highways and massive infrastructure and raising slums, R-A-Z-I-N-G. So I take those 2 initial people as a sign, again, kind of unnoticed, of her critical activist feminist things that she never would have used to possibly describe herself, but that's what she was doing in the doing.
Absolutely. In contrast to that, I think about, can you describe the Eartha Kitt moment, which is a very sort of a different thing, but
Yes, I can. And this is where I'd like to just give a little plug to my podcast, which
yeah.
ABC News and Best Case Studios produced. We made this 8-part audio podcast. This coming week is the last episode, but you can subscribe to it and listen, because we've used so much of her audio diary to tell the story and so much archival material. And the Eartha Kitt episode, I'll try to be very concise about it, but in January of 1968, after the country has had a year and a half or 2 years of uprisings in American cities, we called them riots then, but they're a little bit more complicated because they're about police brutality and the lack of opportunity and housing, and there is some property damage, but they are uprisings in the vein of what we saw last summer here in this country. In any case, by January of 1968, LBJ hasn't announced that he's going to step down yet, and he's backing a big crime bill because he's under pressure from guys like George Wallace and from the Republican Party to be tough on crime. That's the euphemism. Another one is law and order, right? So he's pushing this crime bill, and Lady Bird, as I said, it's a joint political operation, East Wing, West Wing, decides to host a luncheon, this time about crime in our streets. And she invites Eartha Kitt to participate, not as one of the speakers, but the people that come to lunch do participate in these conversations. Because Eartha Kitt is a civil rights activist, and she's putting her money into supporting kids in Watts and kids in Anacostia, sort of empowerment classes and dance classes, and to create opportunity. So Kitt comes to the luncheon, and she violates protocol totally by challenging the president and Lady Bird, not just on their thinking about crime in our streets, but also takes them on Vietnam. And it's really a very bold, risky move, because she says, you want to know why people are in the streets? They're in the streets because of Vietnam. And she tries to connect the domestic with the foreign policy in ways that crosses all kinds of protocol lanes that you just don't do when you go to the White House. You're asked to talk about one thing, you don't talk about another. And the White House reaction to this was to basically launch a smear campaign against Eartha Kitt that damaged her career for decades in the aftermath.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting because that was a moment when I saw that Lady Bird had the same vindictive skills as her husband. And that's one of usually she could hide it, but there was some, I think, what was it? Reward your friends and punish your enemies was one of the, I think, LBJ cliches, and punish meant scorched earth. And I think she was, I don't know. I thought that was fascinating.
I think it was her lowest moment. I mean, it was the fact that she allowed it to happen or even instructed it to happen. I think Liz Carpenter was certainly in the lead on that. Maybe LBJ was as well, but collectively, the three of them were, as you say, scorched earth about it. And Kitt lived in professional exile for a couple of decades after that. Yeah. She lost all of her gigs. I mean, it was old style McCarthyite smear tactics. And there was such a race dynamic in it too, right? That a black woman comes and challenges a Southern white woman on her turf in a mansion built by enslaved people, right? If you really think about it, it's a devastating moment in the story and in her story.
No.
And I don't know, Mimi, if she ever, I wish I knew, but I don't know how she reflected on it subsequently.
It would be interesting to know, because it is sort of Mean Girls, in an early iteration. We have 1 minute left. I hate to end on a negative note. Is there something else you'd like to say before we have to go, besides read this wonderful book?
Well, read the wonderful book and certainly take a listen to the podcast. But I'd also just like to say that the story behind beautification inside the book is really one of my favorites. especially, no, I mean, I say that, I mean, I know you're laughing, but
yeah.
I had to cut a lot of it, and still there's a lot there, as Mimi notes, but it's like so much of the Johnson presidency, in the sense that there is a story of ambition and a progressive vision that winds up unrequited. And so it's a story that ends quite sadly. But as you say, the drawings from the landscape architect she commissioned to develop the riverfront space along the Anacostia River in largely Black Washington is now something, now we're 50 years later, coming to fruition. So in Washington, D.C., we're seeing, although it's very tough for the residents, a lot of development and gentrification, and it's moving people out as a result. But I think her insight about access to nature, making us fundamentally whole, is something that she brought to Austin with Town Lake, with what became Lady Bird Lake, with all of those beautiful urban parks and trails that she campaigned for. So there's a through line on that, and I guess I'd end on that note, that the dream died, but she brought it home.
But it lives on inside, and thanks to your book, now more of us know and we're more aware. So thank you so much, Julia. It was really a pleasure. So.
Mimi, thank you so very much for your wonderful support and time and thought with me about this.
We'll talk again. All right.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks for coming.